Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. So I want to go on and dig into the second section of the course, which is a really important section, and we're going to cover the three sociological perspectives. Now, when you first start learning this, it can feel tricky and feel difficult. So please read all the extensive reading and lecture notes, do the assigned readings, the supplemental readings, all those kind of things will help you with this because we're going to keep revisiting these perspectives. For example, one of the first perspective we're going to talk about is symbolic interactionism. We're going to talk about a lot of social issues in this class, and we'll constantly highlight, how does a symbolic interactionist analyze this issue? How does a structural functionalist analyze this issue? How does a conflict theorist analyze this issue? So you can kind of see how we'll continually revisit these perspectives. But just to begin, think of these perspectives in that way, that if you are housed in one of these major sociological perspectives, it frames how you analyze issues, how you think through larger sociological problems. And so always, start off with that premise. And then once you're able to do that, you can dig into the fundamental assumptions for each perspective. And you can see what is really the foundational elements of that perspective that then is going to inform your analysis and inform your lens if you're housed in one of these three approaches. Now, I want to go on and dig into the first of the three sociological perspectives, symbolic interactionism. And you'll notice that this is highlighted as a micro perspective. And what that means is while the next two perspectives focus more, or not solely a top-down approach, but feel much more top-down because a lot of the focus is on macro level, societal level factors. Symbolic interactionism is very much focused upon day-to-day interactions and how do our day-to-day interactions, our reactions, all those kind of things actually shape larger society. And now I'm not just going to, you can read everything that's on these fundamental assumptions that are on the slide and in the reading. However, I want you to begin to see how a symbolic interactionist, approaches social issues and tries to analyze the world around them. So a lot of the symbolic interactionist approach is based on the idea that we give things meanings. And based on the meanings we give things, that's going to influence our day-to-day interactions or our day-to-day actions. However, those meanings are socially constructed. And in order for by social construction, and I'm going to talk about social constructions at length this semester, but just always think if something is socially constructed, that means it can also change. It can change across location, it can change across groups, it can change across time. And so I give some examples in the reading and lecture notes how a symbolic interactionist may analyze social issues and show how these things can change. So, for example, I'm a criminologist, so I tend to give a lot of examples from the criminology world. Thinking about something like marijuana. Marijuana, in terms of how we define marijuana use, how we think through marijuana legality or not, all that kind of stuff is really in flux right now. And the way to think a symbolic interactionist would look at this is every day, our day-to-day interactions are based upon the meanings we give to objects and to actions. So for example, if we define marijuana in a negative light, if we think that it's immoral, it is unlikely that we're going to engage in that. Now, then the question becomes, well, how do we define it in an immoral light? What about marijuana made us look at this in a negative light and thus us not engage in it? Now, a symbolic interactionist is going to think that part of how we socially construct the meaning, whether it's negative or positive around marijuana, is influenced by our social surroundings. However, those surroundings are also influenced by other factors, and this can change. So for example, if right now you do not engage in marijuana use because you define it as immoral, that may be because you've grown up in a household that defined marijuana as immoral. Maybe your friends define marijuana as immoral. Those kind of things are going to influence how you define marijuana use and largely impact whether you decide to engage in it or not. Now, you can also have a neutral definition of marijuana use, where you really don't see it in a positive or negative light. However, maybe you do or do not engage in it based on social situations. However, this can change, and we're seeing this change a lot. I'm always amazed at how far public polling has moved around Americans approving of making marijuana legal for medicinal or recreational purposes. And the symbolic interactionist is going to look at how Marijuana was largely once seen as a gateway drug in America, largely defined in negative lights across broad swaths of the public, and it was also illegal. And now we can get into, we will do that in classes like deviant behavior, the influence of both the legality of it and how that is filtering into our analysis of whether it's positive or negative. However, a symbolic interactionist is going to show, as our perceptions of marijuana have changed, as we begin to either apply neutral or positive definitions to it, you're also seeing our larger structures in terms of our lawmakers and policies around, criminal justice policies around marijuana. Those kind of things are changing because our day-to-day interactions around marijuana and our meanings around marijuana use are changing. Now, that is where you see the social construction of change across time. Because as we move through time, public polling continues to show that more and more Americans are in support of making marijuana legal. However, this can vary widely across societies too. There are plenty of societies in which marijuana has been legal for years, and it is a lucrative part of their economy. And so what that shows you is the idea of marijuana being negative or positive or neutral, it's not absolute. It varies across people, across groups, across times. However, a symbolic interactionist is going to look and see how what we do day to day is largely influenced by these socially constructed meanings. And then these day-to-day interactions are going to have larger impacts on society. So thinking back to the sociological imagination, that's what we're really getting into, right? That these larger elements of society and those around us are influencing how we socially construct meanings, which influences our day-to-day actions. Then our day-to-day actions influence larger social policies, larger social structures, and things of that nature. So you can kind of see where symbolic interactionism is looking a lot at these individual level, micro level factors, bottom up approach. Now, the next perspective is the structural functionalist. And this is where you begin to see the macro level factors. And what you're going to notice very quickly and very early on is a lot of how most of the way that structural functionalists are approaching and understanding society is at odds with the conflict approach. And so it'll be easy probably to learn the structural functionalist and conflict approaches because they both are macro approaches that are essentially making very different arguments about the role of social institutions, the role and how society operates in general. So structural functionalists, they tend to describe societies in a way that they're essentially using a metaphor, and they're comparing societies to the human body. And what they're doing with that is they're saying, just like in our human body, we have all these different organs that address individual health needs. If one of our organs begins to fail, the rest of our body is impacted by it. But what our body is always trying to do is reach this point of stasis. And structural functionalists think that exactly is what's going on in society. That we have all these social institutions, like education, like the military, like mass media. And these social institutions address social needs, and they are all meant to bring our society to a point of stasis. So, for example, just like the human body, if some parts of the body begin to fail, others adapt. A structural functionalist thinks the same thing happens in our society, meaning that if one of our major social institutions changes, the other major social institutions will have to adapt to that in order to get society back to a point of stasis. I've included a link on this PowerPoint and in the reading lecture notes to a video explaining structural functionalism, but they do a really good job, I think, of showing and thinking through how Amazon. You can really see how Amazon has changed our economy. Society has adjusted around that. And a structural functionalist would say, that's an example of as our economy changed in terms of Amazon's role in our economy, the rest of society is now adapting to it in order to reach a point of stasis. I think that with the current COVID pandemic going on, you can see a lot of this at play too. You can see where certain institutions in our society are going to have to change, are changing right now, and will continue to change. Within the social institution of the economy, you're seeing our economy have to adapt to a new reality. You're seeing companies produce more PPE for medical professionals. You're seeing our economy have to adapt for new needs of a society that is now focusing upon social distancing. Now, the question then becomes, well, if this COVID pandemic is going to create long-term change in our economy, what will happen with our other social institutions connected to the economy? The most obvious example that you all will be interested in is education, right? Education, part of the role of our education system is to train you all for the economy you're about to enter into. Now, if the economy is going to look different in a year to 5 years because of this pandemic, then the education institution is going to have to adapt. It's going to have to adapt the way it is preparing students for the economy because the economy has changed. Once again, a structural functionalist is going to say, see, this is one social institution changing and the others adapting to it. And that's kind of really the heart of structural functionalism. Now, structural functionalism is going to always also talk about deviance and social change. And they're going to argue that anytime you see social conflict and anytime you see deviance, it's because there are strains either within institutions or between institutions. And that social change is going to try to push society to some kind of new form of stasis or new form of status quo. Now, as I mentioned before, a structural functionalism and conflict perspective are very much at odds in different ways. And one of the biggest criticisms of structural functionalism is it doesn't do a good job of analyzing and identifying the way that power differentials impact and shape society, the way inequality is kind of a embedded part of our society, and really better understanding the role of social change. And that's where conflict perspective is going to come in. Because while structural functionalism, what you're hearing right now is largely an optimistic view of society. This idea that society is always adapting to meet social needs, and then that in a way that helps people of society. Conflict theorists is not going to have that rosy of a picture of society. They're going to look at these inequities and embedded power differentials within society and actually see a society that functions to further perpetuate those. And we'll get into that in a minute. But I will be wrapping this video up and then making a second video in which I wrap up structural functionalism and then give you a quick overview of the conflict perspective.